All right, so welcome to Engaging Users Through Accessible and Pedagogical Guides. This was a workshop that I proposed for OLA, and I actually think the webinar format might end up working out better. So this is pretty exciting. This is my first solo webinar. You'll notice Mandy Garcia's name is also on the title slide here. Here's a picture of me on the left and Mandy on the right. Mandy is the library's designer and exhibits coordinator. And although she was originally going to be my co-presenter at OLA, she's not able to co-present today, but I wanted to make sure she had credit. I also want to say thank you to all of these folks whose names you see on the right, who have been really helpful to me along the way. So these are some of the outcomes that I'm hoping for today. And I'm just going to pause and apologize if you hear my dog chewing or scratching under the table. I'm sure we're all dealing with similar distractions and things from home. My hope is that everyone will be able to articulate the difference between Pathfinder and pedagogical guide design, that you'll be able to apply knowledge of text accessibility to LibGuides specifically for graphics. And we're going to talk about videos just briefly as well. And then this last one is going to be the toughest one for the webinar format, drawing or sketching out an aspect of the research process. So if you have a piece of paper handy, my thought was to invite you to doodle while you pay attention to the webinar. And then if you would like to take a photo, you can tweet it to me at Soccerbrarian, or if you're feeling a little bit more ambitious, I suppose, you can try this whiteboard app. And my colleague Betsaida was going to pop the links for that into the chat. But if that becomes too distracting for you, please do not worry about that. It's just a little way to capture some of your engagement with these ideas. So I want you to think about the purpose of a guide. What comes up in your mind? Oh, let me pause. So what I want you to draw is actually your concept of the research process. But you can just draw whatever comes up for you if you like. Feel free to doodle. Okay, so what is the purpose of a guide? As I was laying awake in bed thinking about this presentation, I started thinking about the two kinds of guides in sort of the framework of the Sage on the Stage versus Guide on the Side debate, where the Pathfinder is kind of like that curated list of best bet sources. And a pedagogical guide, which I'll be defining for you all in a moment, is a little bit more of the type of guidance and support that reflects the nature of inquiry. So my slide looks blank at the moment. Are you all seeing? Let me exit out of the stop share. A little strange. Let me pop back in there and see if it looks like I might be having a Safari error. So just a moment. Okay. Let's see if, hopefully you can see this now. Okay, looks better from my end. So here's the origin story. Here's where all of these ideas kind of came up for me. I was a new librarian, an academic librarian in about 2014, and learning how to teach, trying to think about what a research process might look like. And I came across this graphic online, picking a research topic. And it is by Sean Heron. He was the coordinator of library instruction at Wichita State University at the time, and is now the library instruction coordinator at California State Polytechnic University. And at the time I reached out to him because at the very bottom, you can't really see it on this slide, it says copyright Sean Heron, and I wanted to know if I could borrow it. and he gave me permission at the time to use it in my guides. So here's a close-up view. When I say the word infographic, I'm talking about a graphic that explains a process. I think many of us think of infographics as ways to visualize data. But the way that I'm using that term is to talk about things like this that make a process more understandable, more transparent. So what you can see in this graphic, I chopped it in half just to fit it on the slide, but you've got the types of sources on the left: reference sources, secondary sources, and primary sources. And then on the right, you've got types or examples of sources or formats. And as the research topic narrows down into a question, you could kind of tell a story about how the student is narrowing down their research topic into a paper topic or a research question that is informed by this journey of using these types of sources. So this kind of just sparked those types of thoughts in my mind. At the same time, Sarah Lowe started at IUPUI just about 6 months after I did as the educational development librarian, and she introduced us to the research process graphic. And when I saw this graphic, I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if the tabs on the side of my graphic, or excuse me, on the side of my guide matched up with the numbers in the graphic. And so you can see from the screenshot, those side tab navigation labels. I also, at the time, was a new librarian, and one of the ways that I learned how to teach was by watching others and also listening to the stories that other librarians tell. One of my predecessors had left a couple of video tutorials in some of the guides that I inherited, and watching those really taught me new ways to think about all of the ideas that I had just learned in my graduate program. So YouTube's a great place to go for things like that. And then one other piece of sort of the origin story is when I started to learn about what accessibility meant in my teaching and in the classroom. So I'm going to talk through this graphic because I think it's important. So we see a 3-panel scene, each one with a label: equality, equity, and accessibility. Each scene shows 3 people descending in height from left to right, standing in the foreground and watching a soccer game in the background. Equality shows the three people standing on boxes of the same height, and only the 2 tallest can see the soccer game happening across the fence. Equity shows the tallest person standing on the ground without a box, the middle person on 1 box, and the shortest person standing on 2 boxes. All 3 are at the same height to watch the game over the fence. Accessibility shows the wooden fence removed, a metaphorical barrier, and replaced with a chain link fence that everyone can see over or through. No one is standing on boxes. So this is both a really nice visual, but also kind of a verbal illustration of what good alt text or alternative text for an image would read like for someone who might be using a screen reader to understand this image. I also want to add a detail from a colleague at UO that the changing environment or reframing the way that we think about tools in this illustration, the boxes and fence, these thoughts can lead to accessibility and alter the need for accommodation. In other words, reach a broader audience using principles of universal design for learning. Excuse me. I'll come back to the idea of universal design. But I think I have had my own experience working with students using screen readers and other accessibility and accommodation needs that have come up over time. So that's part of sort of my origin story, you could say. So what are the 2 approaches? We've got the traditional pathfinder versus the pedagogical or process-driven style. For the pathfinder, it's illustrated here by the navigation menu. It lists resources by format. This kind of guide has lists of links that lack context. There's little or no pedagogical content. It's very text-heavy, little multimedia, sort of harkens to pre-internet days of very format-focused approaches to library collection, library resources. In the words of Allison Hixs, who I'll be citing from again in a moment, it ignores the broader processes of meaning making that characterize our understandings of the nature of research. And in Freirean terms, as in Paulo Freire, it moves the focus of inquiry from creation to listening and from problem posing to consumption. So a little bit of theory, but don't get scared. We'll come back to that in a minute. On the right side, the pedagogical guide traits. A pedagogical guide has links with context, pedagogical guidance throughout, multimedia. It uses principles of universal design for learning and takes advantage of the internet's affordances. In other words, it can walk a student through the complexities and nuances of the research process. Here's another example of a Pathfinder style guide. I'm using this with permission from a colleague. When I inherited a LibGuide at one point in my career, I got a big block of text like this in the guide, and this was the pedagogical content: background reference research, search strategies, and evaluating sources. So if I put myself in the shoes of an undergraduate and I come to a research guide to get some help, when I hit this wall of text, I imagine my brain would just kind of shut down, or I would scroll past. To me, this is not really, it doesn't reflect the joy, the frustration, and the journey of discovery that research is. On the other hand, a pedagogical style guide, I think, can bring up some of those emotions and some of those thoughts and approaches. So here's a screenshot of the Getting Started with Research guide from the U of O. We'll take a closer look in a minute, but you can see on the landing page, we've got the research as a process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The tabs on the side match. When we would click into the guide, we'll see on step 2, we've got things, we have elements like video, infographics, we've got need help links, and kind of in the bottom right corner, there's a photograph of something that's kind of iconic from our reference collection in the Knight Library at the U of O. So I mentioned Allison Hixs. In 2015, she published LibGuide's Pedagogy to Oppress, a reference to Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator who is seen as sort of the father of critical pedagogy. And this quote, I think, illustrates some of the ideas that I'm trying to communicate. So when we construct LibGuides around the resources that librarians think students should know, we attempt to simplify the process of research. But as Freire points out, this is problematic because it positions research as a transferal of information rather than as an act of exploratory and liberatory meaning making. I also want to mention universal design at this point. Universal design has these sort of 3 overarching principles as a framework. So the idea is if we keep these 3 things in mind, we can make, we can design educational learning objects that are more accessible to more people. So multiple means of engagement, you saw in the pedagogical guide, video, image, text, different ways of sharing information, multiple means of representation. Again, sort of similarly, information content in a variety of ways so that people with different learning styles or abilities can still have access. And multiple means of action and expression will kind of come back to this idea of how students can interact with or even contribute to more of a pedagogical style guide. All right, and again, it looks like I might be having some Safari issues, so let me get out of that and get back in. Apologies for that. Hopefully you can see this all right. So graphic design, in my experience, it's kind of been a luxury item. So I, full disclosure, do not have great graphic design skills. And I've been seeking to partner with someone who does. So fortunately, we have Mandy Garcia at the U of O, and I hope that you all have folks in your organization who can also help with graphic design. Here's a draft of that research as a process graphic that I did on my whiteboard on the left. I was trying to think about ways to customize this graphic for the U of O. And you can see it's a little messy. Number 2 is kind of down here by the roots of a tree. I started thinking about how background information is kind of like the roots, that you don't see them, but it's important. And then Mandy and I sort of, we collaborated, we drafted this second graphic that you see on the right. And it's a little bit cartoony, but we were trying to get an idea for what this might look like. And we kind of ended up with some South Park mountains for a while, but it helped us move forward with our journey. So you might be the person who draws on your whiteboard, you might be the person who makes South Park mountains, but if you can collaborate with other people with skills, I think you can kind of get to a place where everybody's represented, everybody gets to pitch in, you can sort of share drafts out and get feedback. So I'm sharing this with you to illustrate the aspect of the process that's sort of like storyboarding and drafting. I see a chat, so I'm gonna pop over there real quick. Great. So the importance of graphic designer on your team, right? Here's another example of something that I've made. So on the left, I made Finding Books and More at UO Libraries using PictoChart. Again, I don't claim to be a graphic designer, but with tools like PictoChart or Canva, you can at least get a working draft of something that might be useful. And on the right, what we have is a prototype by a student employee that looks a lot cleaner. That's it's got a little bit, it's got different contrast. The elements are bolder, brighter. The icons pop out a little bit. So you can see how helpful it can be to have a graphic designer. Here's another example. Organizing your research. This is a box that I made on the left for our research guides with some suggested ways that students can keep track and stay organized while they're doing a research paper. And on the right is a prototype that our student employee has drafted. So you all are getting a sneak peek and a preview of something that, that we're working on. And what I like about this one is the high contrast between the white or the gray, the light background, and the dark elements, the text, the icons. That's really important for accessibility as well. So how do we make complex graphics accessible? Here's a whole bunch of tips. I'm not going to read them to you. You've got the link to my slides, and you'll have a recording for this as well. But these are just 5 areas that we can all engage with accessibility. I'm going to focus on the alt text for images for a few moments here. And I will also come back to this idea of descriptive links. So, oh, and I wanted to mention as well, so those were general accessibility tips, but here are a few accessibility tips that are more specific to the SpringShare platform. I worked with Alex Mueller, our Thomas intern, to go into the SpringShare forums and do some information gathering. On the left, you see tabbed boxes, this box type. Tabbed boxes are not very accessible. There is a possible JavaScript fix, I think, that can make them more accessible. But for a novice screen reader user, the tabs are really hard to see, and it's not intuitive to understand that they are tabs. It's also not intuitive to understand the relationship that each tab has with the other tabs. So some of the fixes are either really technical with JavaScript, or maybe your institution has decided not to use tabbed boxes. On the right, the guide navigation layout is another area where SpringShare has some accessibility issues. So when you're setting up your guide navigation, I suggest checking the two options: show all subpages inside navigation and show box level navigation for selected pages. And the reason for that is also accessibility. When you have this sort of nested drop-down menu, screen reader users have a really hard time using the drop-down and reading it and understanding the relationship of it to the rest of the navigation. So these are just two issues of otherwise SpringShare has a lot of great accessibility features, and there are a couple references at the end of this webinar that you can look at to learn a little bit more about that. So for a complex infographic like this, alt text is not enough. It'd be ideal if you could create the graphic in HTML as an accessible image from the get-go. But if you're like me and you're starting out with Canva or Piktochart, you're going to have to think about accessibility in a different way. And I'm going to do kind of a live demo of what my workaround is for this. So we're going to pop out of the slides and over to the Getting Started with Research guide. So here's the guide from the UO Library's website. Here's the graphic. And first thing I'm going to do is show you this link down here at the bottom. Underneath the graphic, there's a link called Long Description of Research is a Process Infographic for Web Accessibility. If I click on that, it's going to take me to a text version of this graphic. And some of the good things about a text version, some of the accessibility features that we can leverage are the use of headings, the research process, the use of numbered or bulleted lists, and just simply using text. So let's show you another one while I'm here. So using Wikipedia for research, do and do not. Pretty simple text version of the same kind of graphic. Now to get back from this guide to the research guide, you would have to use the back button. And I'm going to explain why. All right, so here's what the editing version of LibGuides look like. And I'm gonna pause for a moment. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I think a lot of these ideas are not just for the LibGuides platform. I think that they can be used with research guides on all sorts of different web platforms. But in LibGuides, there's this thing called mapped boxes. So this box is mapped from another guide. It lives in a shared boxes guide. So you're really getting the behind the scenes tour right now. And this is the master box. So any edits that I would make to this graphic or to the text or whatnot, I would make on this master copy. If I go into the edit menu here, you'll see there's some text. It's a little redundant with the text on the graphic, but as far as accessibility is concerned, that's not a bad thing. You'll see the link is down here at the bottom below the graphic. Now, if I want to edit the graphic, I would click on it and go to the image menu in this web editor. And here's where you're going to see the alt text or the alternative text. This is probably the most familiar approach for most of us when making images accessible. So what it says, research is a process infographic. Follow the long description infographic link for a web accessible description. So these words are very important and very specific. It says to follow the link for a web accessible description. I've used language that mirrors what the link says. So the descriptive link is descriptive. Someone using a screen reader would read this text and then go and look for a link that has similar verbiage. And this is helpful for continuity. So we'll go back. Now, let me pop back over to the main guide. So how do I hyperlink the text version into my graphic box? Well, we'll click on this again. Let me log in briefly to the graphic version. All right, so hopefully you're seeing the Research as a Process text version on your screens. And in this box, there's the edit option. Within edit, you go to box link and widget code and you copy the box link. Note that there's no HTTPS colon in front of the link. So when you copy the link and then you go to your graphic to paste it, you will have to add that. So let's take a look. We'll go back over here. Here's the master box. I'm going to go into edit. Now the hyperlink is already here. So I'm going to highlight it. If I were going to add it, I would use this add hyperlink option, or you can unlink. Now, if I click link, we'll paste it. Now, what happens when I paste the link, it switches the protocol to other. I want to switch it back to HTTPS colon / and then I want to go over to the URL and delete those 2 slashes. The protocol wasn't sticky, so now I've gone back and changed it again, and I click OK. Now my link is there, and we can test it to see if it works. It works. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pop back over to my slides. All right, so that was the show and tell version. You've got the alt text example here in the slides. And of course it goes there where the green arrow indicates. Here are the steps we just went through. So hopefully it was more useful for you to see them live than to read them. So maybe now you're thinking, what about assessment? How do I know if these approaches to research guides are more useful for students, are more enjoyable, whatever your questions may be? One approach to assessment is to use a heat mapping tool like Crazy Egg to see where your students are clicking. This was part of a study that I did while I was at IUPUI University Library, and I published the study with Sarah Lowe and Sean Stone. There's a citation at the end of this webinar for that study, so you're welcome to take a look. And this is also a graphic that we used in a LOX presentation. So that was, this is a way of getting sort of direct and authentic assessment and feedback about how people are using a guide. There's another study from Yu Young Lee and Sarah Lowe in 2018 that looks at the positive impact of guides, and the study explored things like emotional response frequency. So in this graph, you can see that the pedagogical guide is the lighter gray, and it had more positive emotional responses from users, and the Pathfinder had more negative. There's also usability and learning experience. Again, the pedagogical guide is the lighter gray, and you can see higher usability and higher learning experience. So more learning took place with a pedagogical style guide. Another way to assess is to get some user input. Ask your students or your users, ask your employees, what do they like? What do they not like about the guide? What could be improved? How do they use the guide? If you have a user experience group in your library, you can work with them to design a study. For example, you could set up a table in your lobby and give people a candy bar in exchange for 5 minutes of their time to interact with or look at a guide. And you could put a comment box or a feedback box in your guide. Drawing, this is a little bit more for the classroom. So if you, like I've asked you all today, to kind of sketch out your research process, you can ask students to draw what their research process looks like or how they feel about research. And then after instruction, you can ask them to draw it again, and that will show you perhaps some of the skills that they've learned. So from this quote from Breyer and Lebin, the before and after drawings can serve as an assessment. Guide views, a built-in feature of the SpringShare platform, can give you a sense of how often the guide is being used and at what times of the year. And then a question for OLA that was important during the proposal process was how does your project overlap, or how does your proposal overlap with goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Excuse me. So at the U of O, we use the IDEAL framework when talking about DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I'll sort of talk about this as I'm thinking through these goals. As far as inclusion is concerned, graphic elements can make the guides more inviting and inclusive. Graphics need to be chosen carefully to represent places, populations, and cultures present in the community. Mandy and I are focusing on an environmental theme that is broadly inclusive in order to ensure that no one feels left out of our guides. We're also using UO web colors to foster a sense of community and cohesion with UO branding. So trying to draw people in through guides that through images that feel familiar and community related. As far as diversity, a diverse team has collaborated with me on the creation of these graphics and consulted with me on the best ways to make them accessible to a wider audience. While most of my graphics are currently in English, I also have plans to make some in Spanish and to work with the UO teaching librarians to develop similar tools in other languages. I think when diverse voices are reflected in our guides, the library becomes richer, and representation matters. So when I embed videos in my research guides, I try to choose videos and animation that show diverse people and diverse perspectives. And then equity is not explicitly one of the ideal pillars of this framework, but as far as equity is concerned, inclusion of text versions reduce barriers and make UO guides more accessible for more users. And I think that all of these ideas play into the framework pillars of evaluation, achievement, and leadership through different ways. So that's just a couple of my thoughts about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to also touch on some critiques of this approach. So the pedagogical guide could be seen as cognitive overload. From that study by Lee and Lowe, we learned that in the UX field, in order to minimize user tension, progress trackers show users their progress along the way by presenting information in chunks as well as in logical and numbered steps. Users see a clear path to completion, thereby minimizing cognitive overload. So by using the numbered tabs and the research process format, we can sort of get at some of these values that come to us from the user experience field. Pedagogical style guides are too long. That's another criticism or critique. And there's a study from Bowen, Ellis, and Chaparro that, that compares a short version of guide navigation with a long version, and they found that using the short version of the guide took more mouse clicks to complete all 5 tasks than students using the long version. It's not a critical approach. So Hixs's perspective is that in creating LibGuides that define research through its resources, we unconsciously reinforce academic power dynamics limit dialogue, and marginalize the student voice from the very academic conversations that surround them. So what I've been trying to explore over the past few years is how to make guides more critical in the ways that Hixs is describing them. And I think that there are a few ways to do it. You can invite your users into that Paulo Freirean dialogue, welcome them to your guide. Here I say, I am your librarian, yo hablo español y portugués. Please contact me. My information is in the profile box in this guide. And there are multiple ways that you can see for my students to contact me or to contact the libraries. And I'll also add, let me go back, that I include my pronouns in my contact information, as well as a text version of my email address rather than just the email me button, because not everyone uses an email client like Outlook. So trying to make my profile box welcoming and inclusive and accessible. You can also include welcome videos, welcome to my guide, welcome to my class. Here's a screenshot from a video that I made in Panopto. And as you can see on the right, the transcript did not generate in Spanish. It didn't render in Spanish very well. So fortunately I had a script and I could go and edit the captions myself, but you want to be aware that if you are using videos, that they have closed captioning and that the closed captioning is somewhat accurate. And one of the other critiques of this approach, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, in addition to coronavirus, all of the thoughts of things going on, is whether or not the numbered tabs and the research process graphic kind of oversimplify the research process. So in response to that, my question for you all is, what is the alternative to a pedagogical style guide? Is it just a pathfinder, or maybe is there another way that people are approaching these kinds of questions? And this quote from Hixs on the right side, I think is useful. So in her paper, she writes, "It was not until I limited my search to WordPress.com and traced a bunch of links and pingbacks that I could even start to gather a sense of the conversation around the topic." And that topic was whether libguides were problematic or not. Yet, ironically, it is exactly this twisting, infuriating, and occasionally joyful process of research that is stifled by the way that most librarians structure and organize their guides. So, so in thinking whether or not this is too prescriptive, I think someone could say, well, a guide with the numbered tabs makes research look like a checklist. It makes it look like it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. But given the rest of the content, I don't think that that holds up. I think it actually suggests, the way that I've designed my pedagogical guides suggests that the research process will take time. And I think it will address one of the issues that faculty mention, that students often wait until the last minute to do their work. I think that if guides are my digital face toward my students, that they should be an asynchronous research, that they should be my voice, and that they should share some of the thoughts that I have about the research process so that students can access that at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night when their paper is due at midnight. And my hope is that the guides would be fun and engaging along the way. In addition, when I use these guides in my teaching, if you can couple the guides with structured worksheets and activities, the pedagogical guides can reduce anxiety around a scary and unknown process so that students can get on with their work and start to engage more with the ideas. And the feedback that I've heard so far, and I've been at the UO for just over a year now, is that this approach is indeed anxiety reducing. It helps students understand what they need to do. So some final thoughts before we get to questions. I would love to hear your thoughts on how librarians can take a more critical approach to guides. I think about things like talking about information privilege, talking about authority of sources in new ways. How can our guides better reflect the nature of research that Hixs described, that joyful and frustrating journey? Maybe this is a criticism that I should have mentioned earlier, but if intellectual freedom is a question, can we find a balance between that and also complying with accessibility standards? I think we absolutely can, and I think hopefully I've shown some ways to do that. I would also ask you to consider using CC licenses and open content, sharing your guides as community guides through SpringShare. And I would like to call for more studies. I think more studies are needed to learn about the retention of IL practices or skills and guide usability and how those two interrelate. Here's a few tech tools that could help you out with your journey. Again, you'll have my slides and the recording, so I'm going to keep moving. These are my references, and I found open access copies for almost everything here where you see a link. I mentioned the descriptive links earlier. This is a terrible example of hyperlinks, because if a screen reader was reading all the links, it would say OA copy, OA copy, OA copy, and you wouldn't necessarily know what to click on. So over here on the image sources, you can see descriptive links that are a little bit easier to use. So I hope that was helpful. I'm looking forward to the questions and answers. I see the chat is blowing up a little bit. So please pop some of those questions into the chat, and you are absolutely welcome to follow up with me at bmaxon@uoregon.edu. All right. So I'm gonna just glance through the chat a little bit. All right, I'm gonna see if I can kind of take the questions as they rolled in. Is there a time when you use links and text to put a LibGuide together, and a time to use more of a graphic approach to LibGuides? You know, I think that maybe you might want to consider, or we might want to consider, whether there should be a difference between a course guide and a subject guide, or a how-to guide. I think for how-to guides, they should absolutely be pedagogical, because you're trying to teach a process. Subject guides are a little trickier because you know, we often look at other librarians' guides to get a sense of the landscape of research in a certain area. And I don't know, I'm not sure. I have my subject guides set up in a pedagogical way, but they also have sort of in step 3 where you're finding your foreground research, you're finding materials. That's where I have that format driven. Those subpages are still kind of in that find articles, find books, find newspapers. And I don't really know what to do with that yet, but I'm hoping you're all willing to help me figure that out. So yeah, maybe subject guides deserve a little bit of a different treatment, but on the other hand, the thing that people often say is that the only users for subject guides are other librarians. So I don't know. How long does it take production time to go from text to graphic? What alternative if you don't have a graphic designer in your midst? I can create a halfway decent looking graphic in Piktochart in 3 or 4 hours, but I've been tinkering with Piktochart and Canva for about 5 years now. I feel like I still have a terrible taste in colors. And so I don't know, it's gonna come down to what resources you have at your disposal. If you've got a graphic designer in your organization, absolutely collaborate with them. It may take longer to get to the graphic that you want, but as you saw with the beautiful graphic that Mandy created, it was worth the wait. If you don't have the luxury of a graphic designer, then play around with Piktochart and Canva, work, get some feedback from your colleagues, your friends, and if it flops, but just keep trying. So there are a couple comments here on combining the two. I'm guessing that that's that sort of question about links and text versus more graphics. Yeah, I think a combination is ideal. If we're thinking about universal design for learning, you want to have multiple ways that people can access the content and use the content. So for general graphics and infographics, do you have a favorite place you find Creative Commons licensed images when you cannot create your own in-house? I use Noun Project for the little icons, like the one on the last slide with the brain, like the profile head and the question mark. For photos, I check Flickr most often. Let's see, I do use the Google image search quite a bit as well. So those are my top go-to places. Okay, I love this question. So in the research is a process infographic with the trees, you seem to use a right to left orientation, which is the opposite of what Heidi thinks of as a usual approach. How did you decide to use that orientation? So that was part of the process of mocking up a draft, sharing it with my department, getting some feedback. And you're right, we did flip the orientation from the way that Sarah Lowe showed it at IUPUI to what we're using at UO. Right to left is how we read in English. It's not how every culture or language reads. So I think that's an opportunity right there for some user testing. With your students or with your colleagues. Thanks, Mary. I'm hoping the rest of you will be like Mary and think about giving your own guides an update. I don't have the polling option, but I would like to ask in the chat if you, so four options I'm thinking of. As a result of coming to this webinar, yes, you're going to make changes, not sure, maybe, or no. I think, or no, not sure. I don't know, whatever, just put whatever you think. Not applicable could also be another option. Great to see people chatting about changes that they might make. Thank you. How do you cite your images, icons, and such? Great question. Well, on the research as a process graphic, the one, I have an example I can show you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I'll pop over to your research question. So here's an infographic. Oops, it says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Let me see what I can do here. Just a moment. I need some elevator music while you wait. All right. Resume share. I think I've got it. Maybe not. I'm going to put the link in the chat. There's a topic to question graphic that you can see in the Getting Started with Research guide. And put that link in the chat for you. At the bottom of it, it says adapted from an original by Sean Heron, Wichita State University Libraries 2015, borrowed from IUPUI University Library in 2019. So that's one way that I cited. On the main graphic, on the landing page of that guide, I also put underneath the link in that same box below the graphic, thanks to IUPUI for sharing the original graphic with a Creative Commons license or something to that effect. So not exactly the same as a citation, but at least like a nod to where it came from. I try to put CC licenses on these graphics that I create so that other people could do the same. With some of the photos that I've put into the guides, I either cite or annotate them right underneath the photo within the box. And if it's my own photo, I might make a note of that, for example. Hopefully that answers. I don't cite the noun project little icons that I use because we have a paid license for those, but if you're using the free version, it's going to come with a little annotation on it that says like from noun project created by whatever the username. So no, I don't necessarily like forgo citing them. I just might not robustly cite them, but I try to model best practices. And I think that actually brings up a really good point. Sometimes in my teaching in the classroom, I explicitly point out the citations or the attributions, that's the word that I meant, underneath photos or underneath images so that students start to pick up on that professional practice. Great comment. So definitely going to consider what attracts a viewer and what distracts a viewer. I think that's like there's a tension there, and I'm not saying that I have the best answers, but I am so glad to just be having this conversation with you all, so that we can kind of continue to innovate together. Right. Any other questions? Well, I'm sorry about the Safari issues. I guess lesson learned. I had to pop in and out a couple times, but thank you for bearing with me. I really want to say thank you to Emporia for this opportunity. And the link is in the chat for the recording. Thank you so much for coming.